Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Glad to have you on board. I hope you had a great week. Would love to have you take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and if you don't like dealing with YouTube, you can certainly reach me over at Rumble under Wildlife Control Consultant. If you're wondering what this podcast is all about, well, we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest control, as well as anecdotal information as well. So if you have a topic, a subject, perhaps you have a product or a service that you are involved in or interested in, to let me know. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Perhaps if you're looking to sell your own product or service, definitely reach out. We'd love to have you come on the show and talk about your product that's related to the services that are going to be suitable for people in the wildlife control field. So we have our audience both for homeowners as well as pest control operators and, of course, wildlife control professionals. So we're glad to have you on board. My book is out, of course, the Vertebrate Pest Handbook. It's the revision of Dr. Austin Frischman's earlier edition, so I've updated that, and it narrowed its scope. It's only dealing with commensals at this point, so I'd love to have you purchase that. You can get it from my site or elsewhere as well. Well, why don't we get started here and talk about, because this week I wanted to talk about baits for commensals. Now, if you're not familiar with the term commensals, commensal rodents mean, commensals just is from a Latin word meaning sharing the table. So it's for those types of rodents in animals, particularly rodents. Typically it would be house mouse, Norway rat, roof rats, or in this sort of animals that live near humans and thrive in human-impacted environments. So that's typically what it's meant by the word commensal. So it kind of has a little bit of a squishy meaning to it, but as a general rule, it refers to those three rodents. So question is, what are the best baits for those commensals? Now, I'm not going to talk about all of the commensals here today. Right today, I'm going to talk about a house mouse bait. This was from a study that was done published in 2021 by Sked et al. And the title of the article is Monitoring and Controlling House Mouse, and then it gives a scientific name there, Infestations in Low-Income Multifamily Dwellings. Now, those of you who are doing field work, multifamily structures, whether you're dealing with insects or whether you're dealing with rodents or other vertebrates, those are some of the most difficult and challenging structures to address. The several reasons. One, the sheer size, right? So size obviously makes it harder. You have a much bigger footprint that you have to address, but also you're dealing with all the individual clients, right? So when people have an apartment, you can't just simply willy-nilly walk into an apartment and do your thing. Some portion of those apartment owners are not going to let you in. And so this study was trying to learn about how they can monitor for house mice in these buildings, as well as how they can control them, into what level of effect could they get. Now, I'm only going to talk about a portion of this particular study, but I want to be sure you get that resource. And so again, that's Sked et al. 2021, Monitoring and Controlling House Mouse Musculus domesticus Infestations in Low-Income Multifamily Dwellings. That was published in the journal Animals, volume 11, pages 1 through 15. So Here are the parameters of the particular study. So they basically picked 2 different apartment buildings, one located in Linden, New Jersey, the other one located in Trenton, New Jersey. And you can see that they really endeavored to try to pick apartment buildings that were relatively comparable. Obviously, they're not going to be identical, but they really did a good job here, I think, in finding locations that were absolutely comparable. The Trenton building has 15 floors, Linden building has 11 floors. One is built on a slab, one has a full foundation in the basement. They both have boiler rooms, they both kind of had laundry rooms. I mean, I didn't include the laundry room on this particular list, but they both had laundry rooms. Hot water, one had hot water heat, the other one had forced hot air heat. And so that's certainly a difference. Each floor sort of had a trash chute. One place used trash compactors on each floor. One place had community rooms with their kitchens, and they had both had sort of community areas and things. But so overall, they were relatively identical. I mean, as close as you can get without creating some sort of a Xerox construction format, right? And what they did note was that the Linden, New Jersey structure did have a higher level of sanitation and exclusion within the structure. So, because they did they did a human-based survey, and then they also used monitoring baits to kind of get an evaluation of the level of mouse infestation at both structures, because they needed a baseline to determine how well their control activities worked. So they did an initial survey, both visually, they interviewed clients, and then they used these monitoring bait stations, and that's what we're going to focus on. Then they followed up with a control, and then they followed up again with monitoring to see how well they did. And I think they did this for an entire year. So it was a pretty substantive study. So those of you working in apartment buildings, how many of you really dealing with apartment buildings this big? That's clearly something that's typical of larger cities. Nevertheless, there are insights here that can be useful for those of you that are dealing maybe with four apartment buildings, right? So that is something that are significantly smaller, but the principles are certainly going to apply to you. So let's see what they did here. They basically were testing 3 different monitoring baits. Now, a monitoring bait, if you're not familiar with it, is a non-toxic item that is attractive to mice that can be used to help determine whether there's any mice in the area. It's a way to simply keep food in a bait station, but there's nothing toxic in it, but allows you to determine whether there's any feeding on it. If you have a monitoring bait inside of a bait station and they were eating on it for a while, and then you performed control, and then later there's nothing eating on it, well, then that's an indication that perhaps the population has dropped in that particular area, right? So it's a monitoring station. And so they used 3 different monitoring baits in each station that they set. So one of them was the D-Tech soft bait with Lumitrack. That's created by Bell Labs. The other one was Leaf-Attack rat and mouse attractant. Now, I've tried to look up this particular product, and I couldn't find it. However, I was able to find like a label with that title in an SDS sheet with that title, but when you read it, it didn't have those terms. It actually used the name No-Tox soft bait attractant. So I don't know for certain, but my suspicion is that Leaf-Attack changed the name of their product after this study was published. So I wasn't able to find Leaf-Attack rat mouse attractant. I was only able to find No-Tox. Now, No-Tox comes in 2 different forms from Leaf-Attack, the soft version and the block version. So I've circled the one that is soft because the Leaf-Attack rat and mouse attractant that was described in the publication was a soft bait. So my hunch, Just to be clear, I want to kind of lay this out here for you. I'm sorry for this type of squishiness, but I don't want to misrepresent something here. But my suspicion is that No-Tox was the Leaf-Attack rat and mouse attractant that was used. It's just been rebranded. But I don't know that for certain. I'd have to reach out to Leaf-Attack and find out, and I'll have to do that at a future time. The third bait that was used in the bait station was Hershey's Spreads Chocolate, which is sort of intriguing, right? So they basically had two professionally manufactured monitoring baits from two major rodent control companies and Hershey's chocolate spread. Okay, so fascinating question. So they did this side-by-side test, and if you've been following my podcast for any length of time, you know that I've been begging, pleading, cajoling all of the wildlife control operators that you should be testing your baits, all right? You should be doing a little bit of research in all the work you do. Not all of the work, a little bit of research. And I have a whole podcast, you can go look it up, on how to perform this sort of monitoring system in terms of testing your baits. And then I even have a discussion on how you can evaluate, how to determine which bait worked better, because it's a little statistical analysis, and I describe how to do that with Excel. So what they did here was this is how they set up their mouse stations. Now, they were using the Bell Labs Protecta Evo mouse station, so I have a little drawing of it here, and they basically set it up in the following way. In the left-hand compartment, they used Detex. In the right-hand compartment, they used the rat and mouse attractant. Then they applied at 3 different locations, basically one at each entrance and one in the middle access point, what they called a dollop, which is basically just a little smidge of chocolate sauce at those 3 locations. And so then they would close that up. So now the mouse would have an appropriate access to all 3 baits. And then they would come back and monitor to see how those baits were consumed or whether they were attractive to mice. And then they would use that data to determine how much mouse activity was occurring in the apartment and, of course, ultimately in the apartment building. So where did they place these bait stations? Well, again, they're looking for consistency, so they placed 2 bait stations per apartment. One bait station was placed in the kitchen, I think preferably near the stove, and the other one was placed in the heating area, typically in the living room. So that would be, for the Linden location, they would put it at the baseboard near the hot water line because Linden used hot water heat, where in Trenton they would place the bait station near the heating duct because Trenton apartment building used forced hot air. Now that's just something to do, a little side note. For those of you, if you're doing mouse control, understand that mice are attracted to heat. So it's very important to be thinking about when you're monitoring and inspecting a structure, where are the heat sources in that particular building, because that is where mice are going to want to be close to, because that reduces the amount of food that they have to consume. And so, plus, it's always better to be warm, right? And so it provides them a lot of benefits. And so the selection of these locations was pretty smart here. The other issue, of course, is heating ducts provide travel ways between apartments because it's hard to have a complete seal around these particular openings, as you well know. Because if you've been doing this business for any length of time, you know, contractors are not always sealing the pipe. They make the hole, they try to be close, but it's never really quite tight enough because there's always a little bit of fudge room, right? And that's what provides us the opportunity to secure those openings to prevent room-to-room movement of animals, or insects for those of you in the insect field. So that is what they did. 2 stations for each apartment, one in the kitchen area, one in the heating area. They also put additional monitors in the trash chute rooms, the perimeter of the compactor room, laundry rooms, and community rooms. So again, they were looking at the entire structure to be placing these additional monitors. So what were the results? Well, the results of these showed that mice, at least in these two structures, were highly attracted to the chocolate. So notice at the 0 month, mice were hammering the chocolate. At month number 6, this is sort of after some control work was certainly done, you have a reduction of the consumption, and then finally in the 12th month you have even additional reduction of consumption. But nevertheless, when you compare chocolate, Hershey's spread chocolate, it was significantly, orders of magnitude, more attractive to mice than the Leafitech bait or the Detex bait from Bell Labs. So what does that tell us, right? So it tells us that perhaps this is something you want to try on your own in terms of determining what to use, perhaps using this sort of shotgun approach or just simply providing dollops of this chocolate sauce. Now, you might want to also be interested that they also used the chocolate sauce even when they were applying rodenticide to see if mice were feeding on the chocolate but not on the bait. But that's a subject for another podcast. So what do we have here? The winner, as I've already mentioned, was Hershey Spreads chocolate. But they were careful to point out, the authors here, were that the mice were likely attracted to the chocolate because they had a prior experience with chocolate. So what does this mean for those of you in areas that are maybe more rural, that may not have a lot of chocolate access, that you may find that your use of Hershey's chocolate spreads will not have the same level of attraction, because according to the authors, mice are more attracted to food groups and food materials that they've already interacted with. So this is where you have to think about what is in the garbage, what is in the trash, what is in the area that the mouse is already feeding on. And if you're in an area that doesn't have a lot of human-based foods, perhaps Hershey's chocolate spreads may not work, but it's certainly something that's worth a try, right? But it means that if you're going to do a Hershey's chocolate spreads in your monitoring system, perhaps if you're in an area that doesn't have a lot of human impacts, that maybe you need to be thinking about a more seed-based non-toxic bait, or of course trying peanut butter, whatever the case may be there. Of course, always look out for allergies, but it's something to think about. And for those of you looking to try something new, perhaps you're having a job that's just really kicking your butt or something, and you're trying to think about another angle of approach, think about this as maybe a possible bait that you could use. Hershey's Spreads chocolate, particularly if you know that chocolate was in the area and that the mice may have already had prior contact with it. So, well, that's it for this week. You can reach me, of course, at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. You can tell me about things you like about the show, what you don't like about the show, maybe even ideas about future shows. And perhaps if you'd like to be on the show, definitely reach out to me. We're always looking for guests to talk about different topics, about things that concern them in the industry. Perhaps there's something, a service that they would like to sell or a product they have. So we're always looking to provide cutting edge and technical information to the wildlife control community. So you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.